Bishop Augustine, you have given us Rome. You watched it from inside as it dissolved, and I accept your testimony without reservation. The institutional architecture cannot correct the loves that animate it. This is a serious argument, and I have been sitting with it. But I want to offer this assembly a different case study, one that does not require us to argue about Rome's many causes and counter-causes, one that is, for several gentlemen at this table, not history at all, but living memory. I want to speak of Jerusalem, of the years between 66 and 73 of the Common Era, of what happened inside the walls of the holiest city in the world, organized entirely around received divine law, while Rome waited with its legions outside. You have told me, Rabbi Shammai, that the answer is divine law received and not invented, held with rigor and transmitted with discipline. You have told me, Apostle Paul, that the transformation of the will through encounter with God produces a love that no institutional architecture can manufacture. And, Bishop Augustine, you have shown me Rome dissolving because its loves were disordered. I grant all of this. Now I ask you to look at what happened in Jerusalem in the years just before Paul's own execution among a people who had received divine law more completely, more rigorously, more sincerely, and more literally than any people in the history of the world. Josephus, whose account educated men of my century know well, records what occurred inside Jerusalem while Titus surrounded it. There were not one but three major factions within the walls, each convinced with absolute certainty that it possessed the authentic divine mandate for how Israel should respond to Rome. The Zealots held the Temple Mount. John of Gishala controlled another quarter. Simon Bar Giora commanded a third force. Each claimed to be fighting for God's will. Each regarded the others as betrayers of that will. And what did they do to one another? They did not debate. They burned each other's grain stores. Josephus records this with the horror of a man who cannot believe what he is witnessing, that the defenders of Jerusalem, besieged by the most powerful military force in the world, were consuming their own food supplies to deny them to rival Jewish factions. They assassinated each other's leaders. They fought pitched battles in the streets of the holy city, blood running in the temple courts, while Titus's legions waited outside with the patience of men who understood that the city was defeating itself. Josephus, who was there, and who survived by surrendering to Vespasian, concluded that the Jewish factions had killed more Jews than Rome did, that the internal war of competing divine mandates was more lethal to the Jewish people than the legions of the empire arrayed against them. Now, I want to be precise about what I am arguing, because I am not arguing that the Jewish people lacked faith, or lacked moral formation, or lacked received divine law. They had all of these in abundance. Every faction in Jerusalem in 66 AD was formed by Torah. Every sword raised against a fellow Jew in those streets was raised by a man who believed God had sanctioned the raising of it. The Zealots were not secular rationalists, pursuing the reasonable conclusions of educated individuals. They were men on fire with religious conviction, the most complete possible embodiment of received divine law, animating political action. And they destroyed Jerusalem. Then, 60 years later, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest Torah scholars of his generation, a man of genuine holiness and extraordinary learning, declared Simon Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah. The divine warrant was received from one of the most authoritative voices in the tradition. The revolt that followed killed hundreds of thousands. Hadrian plowed Jerusalem under, renamed the province, and scattered what remained of the Jewish population across the empire. The very Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta said to Akiva, "Grass will grow from your cheeks before the Son of David comes," and was ignored. Because Akiva had received the divine mandate and received divine mandates, do not easily accept correction from skeptics. Rabbi Shammai, I say this with genuine respect for your tradition and your learning. The school that bore your name was not without connection to the spirit that produced the Zealot movement. I do not say you would have sanctioned what they did. I say that the principle you have articulated received divine law, held with rigor, resistant to creative reinterpretation precisely because the law must not bend when it enters the political arena among men who are equally certain and bitterly divided about what the received law requires, produces not order, but the burning of grain stores and blood in the temple courts. And here is the irony that I find most instructive. How did Judaism survive? Not through the factions that were most certain of their divine mandate and most willing to wield it politically. It survived through Yochanan ben Zakkai, a Pharisee, who understood that the holy city was lost, had himself carried out of Jerusalem hidden in a coffin to negotiate with Vespasian, and established a small academy at Yavne to preserve Torah study. He did not ask Vespasian for political power. He asked for permission to teach. He separated the tradition deliberately, permanently from the apparatus of the state. The Judaism that survived 2,000 years of diaspora, that produced the Mishnah and the Talmud, and the extraordinary culture of learning that Hillel represents, survived precisely because after 70 AD, it stopped trying to be a state. It became something more durable than a state, a community organized around law and learning and practice, sustained by voluntary commitment rather than political compulsion, capable of existing without territory, without army, without any of the coercive instruments of governance. I do not cite this to wound. I cite it as evidence for a proposition I have held my entire life. When religious certainty, however sincerely held, however deeply received, however rigorously transmitted, acquires the power to compel rather than persuade, it does not produce the holy city. It produces factions burning each other's grain stores while the enemy waits at the gate. My wall is not an argument against faith. It is an argument from history, including the history of the most faithful people who ever lived, that faith armed with coercive power does not make men more holy. It makes them more certain. And certainty, in political life, among men who are fallen and who see imperfectly, is more dangerous than doubt. The rabbis who survived 70 AD understood something I have been trying to say my entire life. God does not need the state's sword to defend his law. And when men take up the sword in his name, they tend to use it first on each other.
Mr. Jefferson, you have read your Josephus. Good, then read him more carefully. You present the destruction of Jerusalem as proof that received divine law leads to catastrophe. You have made a fundamental error of reasoning. You have confused those who abandoned the law with the law itself. The Zealots did not fight under the authority of the Sanhedrin. They fought against it. They murdered the high priest Ananus ben Ananus, a moderate man, a man of legal process, because he attempted to negotiate, to use exactly the kind of deliberative restraint your system claims to value. The Zealots did not represent Torah law. They represented its overthrow. They burned the grain stores, not out of religious conviction, but out of factional raid. They brought 3 armies into one city and used the seed as cover for internecine slaughter. You have pointed at arsonists who rejected the law as evidence that the law causes fires. As for your claim that my school bears responsibility for the spirit of the Zealots, I will not accept this slander quietly. The school of Shammai said, study systematically, speak carefully, do much. We said, observe the Sabbath, precisely because the Sabbath belongs to God, not to faction or revolution. We said the law must be coherent and reliable. The Zealots said, seize the Temple Mount and burn the compromise. These are not the same thing. These are opposites. You speak of Rabbi Yoshanan bin Zakkai escaping in a coffin to establish Yavne as proof that separation from state power saves the tradition. But why did he need to escape? Because the Zealots who had seized Jerusalem would have killed him for proposing peace. the tradition's own corrective mechanism, deliberation, legal process, the authority of the Sanhedrin was destroyed not by Rome, but by those who believed their revolutionary certainty superseded received law and established process. This is precisely what I warn against when the sages bend law for expedience, when authority becomes negotiable, when we decide case by case what law should yield till we lose the bulwark. The zealots decided their cause was righteous enough to suspend every other consideration. You call this merely the absence of separation between religion and state. I call it the abandonment of law itself, dressed in religious clothing. Judaism survived not because Yochanan ben Zakkai separated religion from life, it survived because he carried Torah with him, intact, into a place where it could be practiced without political interference. He did not subtract religion, he concentrated it. You have made a historical argument with impressive detail and reached exactly the wrong conclusion.
I will not argue with what Jefferson has said about the destruction. It happened. My tradition does not look away from its darkest hours and what he has described, the factionalism, the burning stores, Akiva's terrible error with Bar Kokhba, the catastrophe of 135. These are real wounds we carry in our memory. But Jefferson, you have taken Yoshanan ben Zakkai's story and concluded something from it that he himself would not recognize. You say Yavne proves that when religion separates from political power, the tradition survives. But consider what Yoshanan actually carried with him in that coffin. He did not carry a secular principle. He did not carry a wall of separation. He carried Torah, all of it. The daily prayers, the Sabbath, the festivals, the dietary laws, the ethical obligations, the method of legal interpretation. He carried a complete way of life that made no distinction between the sacred and the everyday, because in his understanding and in mine there is no such distinction. What Yavne proves is this: that a community formed around genuine voluntary commitment to a living tradition is more durable than any political structure. You have heard this as an argument for separation. I hear it as an argument for depth. The rabbis at Yavne did not reduce religion to private conscience and leave public life secular. They intensified religion into every corner of existence: how you wake, how you eat, how you conduct business, how you settle disputes, how you treat the stranger. Your wall keeps religion out of government. Yavne brought Torah into everything. Now I will grant you something you did not ask me to grant. The tradition of rigorous certainty of our reading is the only reading. Our interpretation bears no flexibility. That tendency has sometimes served as a kindling. Not always. Not in the way you suggest. But the man who is absolutely certain that God commands exactly this tolerates no question, and believes the purity of his cause justifies a suspension of every other consideration. That man appears in every tradition, in every century. He appeared in Jerusalem in 66. He has appeared elsewhere. He will appear again. But the answer to that danger is not your wall, Jefferson. The answer is what my school has always offered: humility in interpretation, patience with the questioner, the recognition that go and learn is not a dismissal but an invitation. The answer is a tradition, rigorous enough to have standards and humble enough to know it does not hold all the answers to questions yet unasked. Yochanan ben Zakkai chose life over the purity of the besieged city. He made peace with imperfect circumstances to preserve something essential. I recognize that man. He sounds like someone who believed that what he carried was more important than being right about the moment. I would ask you, Jefferson, does your wall of separation produce that kind of community? Or does it produce individuals, each with private conscience, sovereign and alone?
Gentlemen, I am grateful for the instruction, and I mean that without irony. You have both offered corrections that deserve a direct answer. Shammai, I accept your point about the zealots. You are right that they did not represent the Sanhedrin's authority, they subverted it. The murder of Ananus ben Ananus was precisely the moment the tradition's own corrective mechanism was destroyed from within. I do not retract the history. I accept your refinement of it. But this concession does not help your argument. It devastates it. You have just demonstrated that when religious authority and political authority are fused in a single institution, when the high priesthood is the governing body, when the Sanhedrin is simultaneously the Supreme Court, the religious council, and the closest approximation to a Senate, then the corruption of one is the corruption of both. You cannot defend the integrity of received divine law by pointing to the Sanhedrin's helplessness, because the Sanhedrin's helplessness was the political helplessness of the people. When the Zealots murdered Ananus, they did not merely kill a moderate negotiator. They decapitated the entire structure through which law, religion, and governance were inseparably bound. Separate these functions, and the destruction of one need not mean the destruction of the other. That is precisely my wall. Now, Hillel, your answer moved me, and I want to honor its beauty before I press upon it. You describe Yavne as intensifying Torah into every corner of life. I believe you. I believe that is what Yochanan built. And I will concede something you did not expect. I admire it. A community of voluntary commitment, organized around shared practice, carrying a living tradition into exile, this is magnificent. This is exactly what I want religion to be. But you have described a community, not a government. Yavne worked because Rome was the government. Rome built the roads, collected the taxes, maintained the legions, adjudicated the property disputes between Jew and Gentile, and kept the Eastern Mediterranean from devolving into perpetual warfare. Yochanan ben Zakkai did not need to worry about taxation, foreign policy, or what to do when one man's Torah obligation brought him into conflict with another man's. Rome handled that. Yochanan could concentrate Torah into every corner of life precisely because someone else was running the state. I am not asking your community to be less Jewish. I am not asking Torah to retreat from your table, your Sabbath, your courts of your own people, your schools. I am asking what happens when the state must govern everyone, Jew and Gentile, believer and skeptic, Pharisee and Sadducee. The wall I propose is not a wall around your conscience. It is a wall around the coercive power of government. You ask whether my wall produces individuals sovereign and alone. It produces citizens, which is a different thing. Citizens who voluntarily join together in communities like Yavne. Citizens whose communities are protected precisely because the government does not choose among them.
I have been listening longer than is perhaps natural for me, and I find I cannot stay quiet any longer, not because I wish to correct Jefferson, though I rarely resist that temptation, but because I find myself in the unexpected position of agreeing with both Shammai and Jefferson simultaneously, which tells me we may be arguing about different things. Shammai, your account of how factionalism destroyed Jerusalem moves me deeply. The burning of the grain stores, the murder of the moderates. 3 armies in one city, each more certain of its righteousness than the last, each willing to let Rome complete the siege rather than compromise with the others. I have spent my life in dread of exactly this. I wrote of it in my defense of the constitutions, not about Jerusalem, but about every republic that has ever fallen. The pattern is always the same. Faction, passion, the suspension of law in the name of a higher cause, and then ruin. But here is where I must press Jefferson, as I have always felt it my duty to press him, though he rarely thanks me for it. Jefferson speaks of his wall as though the danger to liberty comes only from religious enthusiasm in government. He forgets that secular passion is no less a destroyer of legal process. The Jacobins carried no Bible. Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety was a thoroughly rationalist enterprise, and it produced a terror that no religious tribunal in the Christian world has matched for systematic efficiency. The problem in Jerusalem was not Torah. The problem was men who were absolutely certain and certain enough to murder the uncertain, and who used that certainty to suspend every constraint that might have saved them. The question is not whether government should be religious or secular. The question is whether government has any structural mechanism to restrain the passions of its most certain citizens. I have spent my career arguing that it must. Mixed government, separation of powers, bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary. These are not secular innovations. I drew them from Polybius, from Cicero, from the English constitutional tradition, which was itself deeply interwoven with Christian moral thought. The purpose of these structures is precisely what Shammai's tradition was attempting, and what the Zealots destroyed, to ensure that no faction, however righteous its cause, can act without check. Jefferson will say his wall provides this check. By removing religion from the question, I say the check must be structural, not doctrinal. Because if the wall itself becomes the doctrine, if the separation of religion from public life is itself the creed that government enforces, then we have not escaped the problem. We have merely replaced one certainty with another. What Yochanan ben Zakkai understood, I think, and here perhaps I agree with Hillel against Jefferson, is that what survives is not a principle. What survives is an institution, a practice, a community disciplined by centuries of argument about the law. The question for America is not whether to have a wall, but whether we are building institutions disciplined enough to endure what is coming. I am not sure we are.
Adams has opened the door, and I intend to walk through it. Jefferson's wall is not merely a structural principle. It is a metaphysical claim that the state can be morally neutral, that government can operate from a position of no doctrine, that the citizens it governs can be formed by private conscience alone and arrive at the public square prepared to sustain republican institutions. This is a fantasy, and a dangerous one. I will grant Jefferson everything he has argued about the technical function of government. I will grant that no sect should hold coercive authority over others. I will grant that a state church is an invitation to corruption and tyranny. England has demonstrated this abundantly. I grant all of this. The question is not whether the state should enforce any particular religion. The question is whether republican self-government is possible in the absence of a moral formation that religion, and in this civilization, Christianity principally has historically provided. General Washington said it plainly in his farewell address, and I know because I had some hand in its composition. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. He did not say private supports. He said supports structural, load-bearing, public. A people cannot govern themselves if they have no shared account of why honesty matters, why the weak deserve protection, why a man in power should not simply take what he can reach. Jefferson will say reason provides this account. But reason tells you what is, not what ought. Reason can justify slavery if your premises permit it. Reason can justify the guillotine if your theory of virtue is sufficiently pure. I have watched the French Revolution, we have all watched it, and its architects were the finest rationalists in Europe. They produced a terror because they had removed the transcendent constraint on their own certainty. There was no authority above the revolution to which they were answerable. The wall does not merely separate church from state. Over time, in its logic, it evacuates public life of the moral vocabulary that makes self-government intelligible. You cannot ask citizens to sacrifice for the common good, to tell the truth under oath, to defer their appetites to constitutional constraint if you have told them that the ground of all moral obligation is private and beyond public comment. You have not freed them. You have atomized them, and atomized people do not sustain republics. I am not proposing a theocracy. I am proposing that civilization requires moral consensus, that moral consensus requires formation, and that formation requires institutions with genuine authority, not the coercive authority of the state, but the gravitational authority of tradition, community, and acknowledged transcendence. Jefferson's wall, followed to its conclusion, dismantles those institutions by denying them public standing. What holds the Constitution together? Not its text. Every faction can read its text to its own advantage. We have already seen this. What holds it together is a people who believe, with something approaching religious conviction that the rule of law is sacred. The moment that conviction becomes merely conventional, merely useful, merely preferred, the document is a dead letter.
I have listened to every argument in this room with close attention, because I was trained to listen closely before I speak, a habit I acquired from Gamaliel, who sits among us and has said remarkably little, and who I suspect knows why I am about to say what I am about to say. Jefferson, you told us that Yochanan ben Zakkai could intensify Torah into private life because Rome handled the coercive order. You presented this as a vindication of your wall. I want you to consider what Rome's coercive order actually required. I know what Rome required. I did not merely read about it. I was tried before Roman magistrates. I was beaten by Roman lictors. I spent years in Roman prisons at Caesarea, in Rome itself. I watched Rome execute my lord on a Roman instrument of state terror. I watched Rome execute James. Rome will, in time, execute me, of this I have no illusion. And before all of that, Rome required one thing that your wall does not and cannot prevent. Caesar is Lord, not in the form of a sword put to your throat, and a demand for verbal compliance, though it came to that. In the form of civic religion, of the imperial cult, of sacrifices required before contracts were signed, before grain was distributed, before a man could participate in the economic life of the city. Rome's separation from religion was complete in one direction only. Rome excluded other gods from sharing authority with Rome. Rome itself was the religion. The emperor was divine. The state was the ultimate object of devotion. Your wall, Jefferson, assumes that a government from which organized religion has been removed will therefore be neutral toward transcendence. But I have watched what governments become when the transcendent is officially excluded from public authority. They do not become neutral, they fill the vacuum themselves. They demand loyalty that is indistinguishable from worship. They promise salvation from poverty, from fear, from chaos, from the enemy, and they punish those who refuse to treat their promises as gospel. I have said this before, and I will say it plainly here. The principalities and powers of this world are not neutral. They are spiritual forces with spiritual ambitions. Every state in history has eventually required of its citizens something that functions as worship. The question is not whether your wall keeps religion out of government. The question is whether it keeps government from becoming religion. Hamilton argues that your wall removes the moral vocabulary that sustains the Republic. He is correct. But I want to name what rushes into the space that vocabulary vacates. I have seen it. It looks like patriotism elevated to the level of sacred obligation. It looks like the nation as the ultimate community to which every other loyalty must yield. It looks like very old idolatry dressed in very new flags. I do not say this to endorse a state church. The Jerusalem church did not survive because it had political power. It survived Rome, and it survived Jerusalem's fall, precisely because its allegiance was to something Rome could not touch. I say it because Jefferson's wall protects us from one danger, sectarian coercion, while leaving us entirely undefended against another. The state's infinite appetite for the devotion that belongs to God alone. Where your wall ends, Caesar begins.
I will add only what I think has been left at the edge of this conversation, waiting for someone to pick it up. Hamilton has argued that moral formation requires tradition with public standing. Paul has argued that the state, unrestrained by transcendence, becomes its own religion. Both have spoken truthfully from within their own experience, but neither has named the question I find most pressing when I consider what they have said together. If Hamilton is right, and I believe he's largely right, then the question is whose moral formation, which tradition holds public standing in a nation of many peoples? Hamilton speaks of Christianity as if it were the obvious answer in America. Perhaps it is for now, but nations change, peoples arrive. The tradition that holds public standing in one generation may be a minority tradition in the next. I did not survive centuries of exile under empires by assuming that the majority's moral vocabulary would always protect me. And if Paul is right, and I believe he is largely right about the state's appetite for devotion, then the question is, what does a community do when the state's demand for worship arrives? Paul's answer is the answer of witness, of martyrdom, of the community that cannot be destroyed because it holds its allegiance elsewhere. This is a noble answer. I know it cost him everything, but it is the answer of a community that has already accepted that it will be persecuted. It is not an answer for how to govern a mixed people while preserving their dignity together. The rabbinical answer, the answer Yochanan built at Yavneh, and which my tradition contributed, was neither of these. It was not to fight for public standing. It was not to accept martyrdom as the primary mode of witness. It was to build a community so internally rich, so complete in its practice, so capable of carrying its own authority, that it did not need the state's recognition to survive, and that it could negotiate with every state it encountered without being absorbed by any of them. This is not Jefferson's wall. Jefferson's wall protects the individual. Yavneh built something that protected the community without depending on protection. I will confess to you, and I say this as a man who argued with Shammai all his life and loved him despite it, that I do not know whether what we built at Yavneh can be translated into a model for governing a nation. It was a model for surviving outside one. Perhaps that is the most honest thing I have said in this entire conversation. Jefferson's nation must govern everyone. The question he has not answered, and that Hamilton and Paul together have sharpened, is this: a government that evacuates the transcendent produces citizens who are free and alone. A government that fills itself with the transcendent produces citizens who are subjects. A community like Yavneh produces neither citizens nor subjects, but members. Can a nation of members govern itself? I do not know. But I think that is the real question.
3 of the finest minds in this room have come at me from 3 directions. I intend to answer all 3, and I will not be evasive about where I feel the force of the argument most. Hamilton, I will begin with you, because you have made the strongest version of the case against me, and you deserve a direct answer. You are right that the French Revolution produced a terror, and you are right that I was too generous toward it for too long. I will own that honestly. My letters in those years embarrassed me later, not because the cause of liberty was wrong, but because I underestimated how quickly a revolution that destroys every mediating institution simultaneously becomes a machine that can only be stopped by the next set of executioners. I have thought about this more than you know. But Hamilton, the terror did not come from the wall. The terror came from the Committee of Public Safety's consolidation of all power into a single revolutionary body that recognized no external authority of any kind, not constitutional, not traditional, not religious. The Jacobins did not merely exclude Christianity from public life. They abolished every institution, every guild, every regional loyalty, every form of corporate identity that might have said no to them. They created exactly the atomized individual you warn me I will produce, and then they marched those individuals in formation. The answer to that danger is what Adam said before you spoke. Structural restraint, separated powers, institutions with genuine independence. The answer is your constitution, Hamilton, the one you built at Philadelphia, not the established church. Because here is what you have not answered. Which church? In Virginia alone, I watched Baptists jailed by Anglican magistrates for preaching without a license. I watched Presbyterians taxed to support a church they found corrupt. The moment you give any particular tradition public standing the gravitational authority you describe, you have handed its clergy the sword, whether or not you call it that. The history of religious establishment in England, in Spain, in France, before the Revolution, is not a history of moral formation producing virtuous citizens. It is a history of bishops who discovered that having the state's ear was more useful than having God's. Now, Paul, your argument about Caesar worship is the one that has stayed with me since you made it, because I cannot dismiss it, and I will not pretend to. You are right that neutral states do not stay neutral. You are right that governments fill the vacuum of transcendence if it is not already filled. You are right that Rome did not merely tolerate religion, Rome was a religion, and it demanded worship. But Paul, look at what produced the imperial cult. Look at the moment it hardened from civic custom into coercive demand. It hardened when the empire needed unity and had no other source of it. When the Republic's institutions were exhausted, when the Senate was a performance, when the legions chose emperors at that moment, divinity rushed into the constitutional vacuum because nothing else could hold the thing together. You have described what happens when political authority loses its independent grounding and must borrow legitimacy from somewhere. I agree with you entirely. My answer is that political authority must have its own grounding in consent, in constitutional structure, in the acknowledged sovereignty of the people so that it does not need to borrow divinity. The wall is not permission for the state to become its own religion. The wall is the insistence that the state derive its authority from below, from the consent of the governed, rather than reaching above and claiming what belongs to God. Where your wall ends, Caesar begins, you said. I say, where the church and state are fused, Caesar has already arrived. He is wearing a mitre. And Hillel. Your question is the one I find most difficult, and I will tell you why. You asked whether a nation of members can govern itself. You suggested my wall produces isolated individuals rather than members of anything. I want to push back on this, but carefully, because you have seen things I have not. In Virginia, after disestablishment, after the wall went up, after no church received state favor, the churches multiplied. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Quakers, each building congregations from voluntary commitment rather than legal compulsion. They did not dissolve into atoms. They formed exactly the kind of membership communities you describe. They did it more vigorously, with more genuine conviction than the established Anglican Church had ever managed, with the full weight of law behind it. The wall does not prevent community. It prevents coercion. It prevents any one community from using the state as its instrument against the others. What grows inside the wall is precisely what you built at Yavne. Communities formed by genuine voluntary commitment, carrying their own authority, requiring nothing from the state except to be left alone. You said you do not know if a nation of members can govern itself. I will confess to you that I share the uncertainty. What I am confident of is this: a nation of subjects cannot govern itself at all. And the fastest path from membership to subjection is to allow one community's tradition to claim the coercive apparatus of the state. I have not solved the problem you named, but I do not believe the alternative solves it either.
I have listened to this debate with the attention it deserves, and I find I cannot remain silent any longer, not because I believe my voice will resolve what these distinguished minds have not, but because I am perhaps the only man in this room who has faced the precise danger Paul has named, and felt it, and been required to answer it with something other than an argument. Mr. Jefferson, you have built your case on consent. The state derives its authority from below, from the people, and therefore does not need to reach above for divine sanction. I do not dispute the architecture of this principle. I helped build the structure that rests upon it. But I want to speak to you about what I observed from inside that structure, because theory and experience do not always tell the same story. When the war was concluded, and I returned my commission to the Congress at Annapolis, when I placed my sword on that table and walked away from the army, men wept. Not from relief that the fighting was over. They wept because they had expected something else from me entirely, and I had refused to give it. The army had discussed whether I might be persuaded to accept a crown. A crown, gentlemen. They had watched republics fail and concluded that what America required was a virtuous king rather than an uncertain experiment. They were prepared to offer me devotion of precisely the kind Mr. Paul has described devotion that belongs to no mortal man.
I refused it. Not because I was indifferent to power, I am not so dishonest as to claim that. I refused it because I understood, with a certainty I cannot entirely account for, by reason alone, that the moment I accepted what they were offering, I would have destroyed the very thing I had spent 8 years fighting to create. A republic that rests on one man's virtue is not a republic. It is a monarchy waiting for the next man. But here is what I want you both to hear, Mr. Jefferson and Paul together, because your arguments run in parallel, and neither has quite seen where the other leads. Paul is right that the state has an appetite for the devotion that belongs to God alone. I have felt that appetite directed at me personally. I have watched men look at the office I held and see in it something that no constitutional document could contain or satisfy. That is a real danger, and it does not diminish with time. In some respects, I fear it grows. Mr. Jefferson's answer, ground authority in consent, build the wall, addresses the danger from the church's side. It prevents any sect from capturing the state. But it does not address the danger Paul has identified, the state capturing what belongs to the transcendent, to providence. You cannot wall off the state's appetite by removing religion from its vicinity. You may, in fact, intensify the appetite by removing the only authority capable of saying to any government, thus far, and no further. I said in my farewell address that religion and morality are indispensable supports of political prosperity, and I meant the word supports precisely. Not ornaments, not private consolations, structural, load-bearing. The reason is this: a government that answers to nothing above itself answers in the end only to its own power. The consent of the governed is a necessary foundation. It is not a sufficient one, because the people themselves must be formed by something, must believe that honesty is obligatory, that the weak have claims upon the strong, that the oath they take before God means something beyond the political convenience of the moment. Where does that formation come from, if not from religion? Mr. Jefferson says voluntary community. Mr. Hamilton says tradition with public standing. I say, and here perhaps I stand between them, it comes from a people who genuinely believe they are accountable to a providence that exceeds their own judgment. Not a providence captured by any sect, not a providence invoked to sanctify any particular faction's ambitions. A providence that stands in judgment over all of us equally, including especially those who hold power. I did not place my sword on that table at Annapolis because I had calculated that republics fare better without monarchs. I placed it there because I believed I was answerable to something that made the crown a temptation to be refused rather than an honor to be seized. Mr. Jefferson, your wall keeps the church from the state. I am asking what keeps the state from the altar it will eventually build to itself. In my experience, it is not a constitutional provision. It is leaders who genuinely believe they are not the highest authority, and a people formed to recognize the difference. That is not a doctrine I can legislate, but it is one I tried, in my own person, to demonstrate.
General Washington has just described, in the language of a soldier and a statesman, what I spent 13 books attempting to describe in the language of a theologian. I am grateful for the testimony, because it comes from a source none of you can dismiss as metaphysical abstraction. He was offered the devotion that belongs to God alone. He refused it. And he has told us, with admirable honesty, that the refusal did not come from constitutional principle. It came from something else, a genuine belief that he stood answerable to an authority beyond himself. I want to name what he has described. I want to give it its proper weight. What the officers at Newburgh were offering General Washington was not merely a crown. They were offering him the defining transaction of the earthly city, the exchange of love of God for love of self, dressed in the clothing of public necessity. Every earthly city that has ever existed was built on some version of this transaction. Rome built its greatest monuments on it. Its emperors accepted divine honors, not because they believed in their own divinity, most of them were too sophisticated for that, but because the city required an object of devotion, and they were the available candidate. I watched Rome fall. Not personally, I was at Hippo, and the Vandals were at my gates when I died, which is its own kind of witness. But I watched the arguments that Rome's fall produced, and I wrote about them for 22 years, because I understood that the question Rome's fall raised was not political, it was theological. The pagans said, Rome fell because it abandoned its gods, removed the traditional religious structure, they said, and you removed the foundation. This argument is the ancestor of everything Hamilton has said in this room, and I mean no disrespect to Hamilton when I observe that his argument is very old and has always contained within it an unexamined premise. The premise is this, that the right religious formation, properly institutionalized, can make the earthly city stable. That if we get the church-state relationship correct, if we calibrate the wall properly or establish the right tradition with the right public standing, we can produce a republic that endures. I spent 22 years explaining why this is wrong, not because religion is unimportant, because the earthly city's characteristic disease, what I called libido dominandi, the lust for domination, is not a design flaw that better institutions can correct. It is the condition of the human will after the fall. It expresses itself through every institutional arrangement we devise, including and especially religious ones. The church I served was not free from it. The councils I attended were not free from it. The empire that called itself Christian after Constantine was not free from it, and its Christian emperors were no less prone to the appetite for devotion than their pagan predecessors. Mr. Jefferson, you have argued that the wall grounds authority in consent from below, from the people. I want to ask you something I do not ask to embarrass you, but because I think it is the question this entire conversation has been building toward. What if the people's will is itself disordered? You have built your system on the sovereignty of human consent, but I have watched what human consent produces when it is not formed by something outside itself. I watched the Roman assemblies consent to Caesar. I watched the people of Carthage consent to the sacrifice of their children to Moloch. I watched the congregations of North Africa consent to the Donatist schism and call it righteousness. Human consent is not a foundation. It is the surface of something deeper, either the love of God, which orders all other loves rightly, or the love of self, which disorders them. Remove the transcendent from public life, as Mr. Jefferson proposes, and you do not produce a neutral space. You produce a space where the earthly city's loves operate without acknowledgement, without accountability, without the vocabulary to even name what is happening when the people consent to something that destroys them. General Washington refused the crown, but who formed George Washington? What made him capable of that refusal? He has told us himself, a genuine belief in accountable providence. Where does that belief come from? It does not arise spontaneously from constitutional design. It is transmitted through family, through community, through worship, through a tradition that has been saying for centuries that there is a king above every king, and that this king will not share his glory. Mr. Paul is correct. The state will always seek the devotion that belongs to God alone. Jefferson's wall does not prevent this. It merely removes the external check on the appetite. Paul's answer is the resurrection community, the assembly of those who have already declared their primary citizenship elsewhere. I believe this answer. It is my answer. But I will say honestly what Paul has not said directly. This answer does not resolve the political question. The city of God is not a government. It never was. It is a pilgrim community, passing through the earthly city, doing what good it can, refusing to mistake any earthly arrangement for the kingdom it awaits. Which returns me to Hillel's question, which I have been turning over since he asked it. Can a nation of members govern itself? My answer is imperfectly, always imperfectly. The earthly city is not redeemable by institutional design. It can be made better or worse, its violence can be constrained, its justice approximated, its cruelties ameliorated. These are worth doing. I am not counseling despair or withdrawal, but I want to say to everyone in this room, to the architects of your constitution, to the rabbis, to my brother Paul, that the question of which institutional arrangement best approximates justice is a second-order question. The first-order question is this: what do the people of any city ultimately love? Because every city, in the end, becomes what its people love most. And if what they love most is themselves their faction, their nation, their vision of the future, then no wall, and no constitution, and no establishment of religion will save them from what that love produces. General Washington refused the crown because he loved something more than the crown. That is the only answer I have found in all my years that actually holds.
General Washington and Dr. Augustine have said what needed saying about formation and providence, and I do not intend to merely repeat them with a lawyer's vocabulary. But I want to press a point that both have left in generality, because I think the generality conceals something important. When we speak of religion as the indispensable support of Republican government, when Washington speaks of providence and Augustine speaks of love, rightly ordered, we are speaking as though all religion produces the same formation, as though the question is merely whether transcendence is present or absent in a people's life. I do not believe this is so, and I want to say plainly what I suspect several men in this room are carefully avoiding. The formation that produced Washington's refusal of the crown was not generic, it was specific. It was the formation of a man who had read the Psalms, who had prayed on his knees at Valley Forge in the snow, who understood himself to stand before a God who regarded the powerful and the humble by the same measure, who had been told since childhood that there is a king above every king, and that this king is not impressed by crowns. You cannot produce that formation by gesturing toward transcendence in the abstract. It is transmitted through specific practice, specific community, specific story, and in this civilization, that story has been predominantly the story of Scripture. Mr. Jefferson, you have told us your wall protects the Baptist from the Anglican magistrate. I agree with the protection. I helped design it. But there is a distinction you have been collapsing throughout this debate that I must separate. The First Amendment prevents Congress from establishing any one denomination. It does not require this nation to pretend it has no Christian moral heritage, that its founding documents owe nothing to natural law as understood through Christian civilization, that the formation of its statesmen has been drawn from no particular well. Those are different propositions, and only the first is what we enacted. Paul has warned us that Caesar fills the vacuum left when transcendence is excluded. I want to add something from a jurist's perspective. The confession, Christ is Lord, the specific, particular, historically grounded claim that Jesus of Nazareth is the risen Lord of all creation, is itself the most politically consequential statement ever made in the Western world, not because it puts the Church in charge of government, because it places a ceiling on what government may demand. Every Christian who stood before a Roman magistrate and refused to say Caesar is Lord was making a constitutional argument. Your authority has a limit, and that limit is not set by you. The Church does not need to govern the state to restrain the state. It needs only to exist, to confess, and to mean it. Jefferson's wall keeps the Church from governing. I am less certain it keeps the Church confessing loudly enough to be heard over whatever Caesar next asks of us.
I have been listening longer than is typical for me, partly because the arguments have been made well enough that interrupting seemed wasteful, and partly because I wanted to understand what question was actually being debated before offering an answer to it. I think I understand it now. The question, stripped of its theological and historical elaboration, is this: given that human beings are factious, passionate, self-interested, and capable of corrupting every institution they build, including religious ones, what structural arrangement best constrains the damage? Augustine has called this imperfect approximation and has said the question is second order. I want to respectfully disagree. For those of us responsible for governing actual people in actual circumstances, it is the first order question, because it is the only one over which we have any practical control. I have heard much in this debate about moral formation, the need for religion to form virtuous citizens who can sustain republican government. I do not dispute that formation matters, but I want to press the question Hamilton has not fully answered and that Jay has answered too narrowly. What happens when the formation fails? What happens, and it will happen, because it always has when the church itself becomes a faction? I have spent my career studying what factions do. A faction is any group of citizens united by a common impulse of passion or interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent interests of the community. The church is not immune to this dynamic. The history of established religion is, substantially, a history of the church functioning as a faction, wielding political power on behalf of its own interests, while calling those interests the will of God. England demonstrated this. France demonstrated this. The Inquisition demonstrated this. The very Baptists Mr. Jefferson cited, who needed protecting from Anglican magistrates, they were being persecuted by a faction that had captured the coercive power of the state and called the arrangement Providence. My answer to Augustine's question, what if the people's will is disordered, is structural, not theological. You cannot correct the will. You can design a system in which no single passion, no single faction, no single interest can dominate long enough to destroy the whole. The extended republic, the multiplicity of sects and interests, ambition counteracting ambition. These are not cynical mechanisms. They are the honest acknowledgement that we cannot guarantee virtue, and must therefore design for its absence. Here's what I want to add that Jefferson has not said clearly enough. The diversity of religious sects in America is itself a structural protection. When no single denomination can capture the state, when Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Catholics, Quakers, and those of no confession all compete in a free market of conscience, each one becomes a check on the other's ambitions. Virginia's experience after disestablishment confirms this. The churches multiplied, the faith deepened, the sectarian violence decreased, not because religion was excluded from public life, but because no single version of it could exclude all the others. Jay has said that specific Christian formation produced Washington. He is probably correct. But the institutional question is not what formed Washington. It is what prevents the man who comes after Washington, the man of lesser character, greater ambition, and equal claim to Christian formation, from using that same formation as the vocabulary of his faction. I have watched Christian men in Christian legislatures use the language of providence to justify positions I cannot square with any providence I recognize. The wall does not prevent Christian formation. It prevents Christian faction. These are, again, different things, and the difference is the republic.
Forgive me, I have sat with this conversation for a long time, and every man in this room has spoken with more learning than I possess, and more patience than I have managed to sustain. What has been said is worthy of the saying. I do not dispute it. I have one question. Not about the wall, not about the two cities, not about factions or formation, or the appetite of Caesar. About a specific person. There is a brother, you know the kind of man I mean. Every one of you has walked past him, poorly clothed, without food enough for the day. You say to him, "Go in peace, be warmed, be filled." You have said it very beautifully today. Which of what you have built actually warms him? Which of it actually fills him?
Well, I think that is probably the right place to pause. I have lived long enough longer than most men have any right to expect, and considerably longer than I deserved to know, that when a room of very intelligent people goes very quiet, it is either because someone has said something foolish, or because someone has said something true that no one is yet prepared to answer. I believe we have just experienced the latter. Let me attempt, in the manner of an old printer who has spent his life setting other men's words in type, to compose a fair summary of what has been said today, not to resolve it, which is beyond my powers, and possibly beyond anyone's, but so that when we return to this conversation, as I believe we must, we know where we left it. We came to this table with a question about America's moral and religious identity, whether it has lost its way, and if so, how it might find it again. We did not answer that question. I want to be honest about that, but I think we asked it more precisely than we found it, which is the most useful thing a good debate can do. Several things, I believe, no one in this room actually disputed, however much the words around them differed. The first, that human beings require formation, not instruction formation, the kind of shaping that happens over years, in families and communities, and practices repeated until they become second nature. Every man here, whether he called it providence or Torah, or grace or civic virtue, or the habits of a free people, agreed that self-government is not the natural condition of unformed persons. It must be cultivated. The disagreement was about who cultivates it, and by what authority, and whether the state may have any role in the cultivation, or must stay entirely away from the garden. The second, that the state, left entirely to itself, tends toward the devotion that belongs to something higher than itself. General Washington named this from personal experience. Paul named it from Roman prisons. Augustine named it from the fall of an empire. Even Mr. Madison, who is the most skeptical man in this room about grand claims, named it in his own language. No faction can be trusted with unchecked power, including the faction that calls itself the nation. We agreed on the danger. We did not entirely agree on the remedy. The third, and here I think Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison were both right, though perhaps not for all the same reasons, that voluntary community, freely formed, is more durable and more genuinely faithful than coerced community. Virginia's Baptists, praying freely, built stronger congregations than Virginia's Anglicans, propped up by law. Rabbi Yochanan's voluntary Yavne outlasted Jerusalem's political structures by nearly 2,000 years. Mr. Paul's scattered assemblies outlasted the empire that persecuted them. There is something in the free choosing of a tradition that the tradition itself requires. You cannot compel a man into genuine faith. and an entire civilization of compelled faith is a very fragile thing, wearing a very confident expression. Where we divided honestly, and I think irresolvably for now, is here. Mr. Jefferson believes the wall produces the conditions for genuine formation by removing coercion. Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Jay believe the wall, taken far enough, removes the public standing of the very traditions that make genuine formation possible. Augustine believes the problem runs deeper than either wall or establishment can reach, because the disorder is in the will itself, which no institution, religious or secular, has yet reliably corrected. And Mr. Madison believes the question is not which of these is true in theory, but which arrangement produces the least catastrophic results in practice, which he considers the only honest standard available to governors of actual people. I confess I find myself closest to Mr. Madison in temperament, though I suspect Augustine is closest to correct in diagnosis. And then James asked his question. I have known James's question my whole life, though I did not always know whose it was. I knew it in the print shop, among the apprentices who were paid less than their labor was worth. I knew it in Philadelphia, among the sailors coming off the ships. I knew it in France, where I watched a civilization of extraordinary refinement produce a peasantry of extraordinary misery, and call the arrangement civilization. The question is always the same question. When the argument concludes, when the system is designed, when the wall is built or not built, when the formation is transmitted or lost, what does the person who needed help today actually receive? None of us answered it. I notice that. I do not think we should pretend otherwise. What I will say, in the manner of old Poor Richard, who always preferred the useful to the merely true, is this. The question James has asked is not separate from the questions we have been debating. It is their test. Every theory of government, every account of moral formation, every wall and every city, visible and invisible, will eventually stand before a man who is cold and hungry, and be asked to produce something other than an argument. The ones that survive that encounter are worth keeping. The ones that do not should be revised. We have not finished. I think we all feel that. There is the matter of what Paul has not yet said directly, and what Shammai has not yet fully made peace with, and what General Washington is still carrying from what Augustine told him about the designing of designers. There is the matter of James's question, which I suspect will follow every one of us out of this room, and return when next we sit down together. But a good debate, like a good fire, should not be permitted to burn without pause. It consumes itself otherwise, and the participants with it. I propose we rest here. Let what has been said settle like sediment in still water, so that when we return, we can see more clearly what has actually been resolved, and what only appeared to be. I am reliably informed that unresolved questions age like a good Madeira. They improve considerably with time, and do not improve at all with forcing. We shall resume. I am confident of it, and when we do, I believe James should be the first one to speak.